Good morning, everybody, and thank you for watching this video. My name is Eugenio Petrovich, and I am postdoc at the Department of Economics and Statistics of the University of Siena. Today, I will present you a study entitled Uncovering the Social Network of Recent Analytic Philosophy by the Analysis of Acknowledgements in Academic Publication. Let's start by a brief outline of the talk. I will start by introducing the topic of acknowledgements analysis, and I will try to explain you why acknowledgements are an interesting source for the study of analytic philosophy. Then I will present you the methodology I followed in this empirical study. In particular, I will describe the corpus I analyzed and the methods I used for extracting data. I will then show you the main results of the quantitative analysis, and lastly, I will conclude by summing up the main findings, and I will sketch some topics for future research. An important warning is that this study is still a work in progress, so any comment, feedback, or criticism is greatly welcomed. Okay, so let's start from the place of acknowledgements in analytic philosophy. A first interesting fact to note is that in the last century, these texts have become a sort of standard element in analytic philosophy articles and books. As you can see from the plot on the left, the percentage of articles in Mind featuring an acknowledgement rose from 7% at the beginning of the 20th century to the 83% at the end of the century. If we look more closely at one of these texts, we discover that the acknowledgements are a rich source of information about what we may call the social context that surrounds a paper. We find mention of the meetings and conferences where papers are discussed, but also the funding agencies that provide the financial support for the research. And most importantly, we find the names of several persons that provided different kinds of contributions to the articles, from research assistance to moral support. They are called acknowledges. Therefore, the analysis of the information contained in acknowledgements allows us to reconstruct first the social context of analytic philosophy, that is, the network of persons, institutions, and other actors that participate in the collective production of analytic philosophy. Secondly, the network of informal collaborators that support authors. And thirdly, by tracking who are the most mentioned persons in the acknowledgements, we can reconstruct how the symbolic capital is distributed in the community of analytic philosophers. I now pass to describe the methodology I used to extract this information from the acknowledgements. Starting from the corpus that I analyzed, it comprised 2,073 articles published in 5 prestigious analytic philosophy journals, namely the Philosophical Review, the Journal of Philosophy, Mind, Nous, and Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. The corpus stretched over a period of 15 years from 2005 to 2019. To extract the data from the acknowledgements, the starting point were the full texts of the article, from which the section of the acknowledgements was manually extracted. And at this level, we can already say that almost 95 of the articles in the corpus featured an acknowledgement. Moreover, you can also measure the length of the text in words and detect the presence of funding. However, as I said before, the most interesting information are the names of the persons mentioned in the text, the acknowledges. To extract them, I used an algorithm of named entity recognition included in the Python package spaCy. The algorithm is able to identify in a text written in natural language the names of the named entity, extract them, and classify them in various categories. In this way, I built a database containing the metadata of each article in the corpus, along with the names extracted from the acknowledgement section in their category. A crucial step was the cleaning of this raw data. As you can imagine, the same person can be mentioned with different names in the corpus. These variants must be normalized to a standard version in order to properly compute the mention statistics of each acknowledgee. After the extraction and cleaning of the names, I wanted to enrich the information about each acknowledges. Hence, I used a Python script to automatically search the acknowledges' names in Scopus, a multidisciplinary bibliographic database, and retrieve their university, city, and country of affiliation. The algorithm had a quite good recall rate. In overall, I was able to retrieve more than half of the acknowledges. For the analogies mentioned more than 5 times, the recur rate was almost 90%. Scopus allowed us also to retrieve bibliometric statistics for the analogies, such as the number of citations they have gathered in Scopus and the number of publications they have authored. Lastly, I used an algorithm for automatic gender recognition in R to attribute a gender to the analogies based on their first names. Clearly, I also manually corrected for wrong gender attributions. At the end of this enrichment procedure, each analogy in the corpus was characterized with 10 variables divided in 4 categories that comprised biographical, affiliation, bibliometric, and mention data. Let me now present to you the main results of the study. From the analysis of the acknowledgement's length, it emerged that the average acknowledgement is around 65 words long and mentions 8.3 different persons. However, as you can see from the histograms on the right, the distribution of the number of persons in the acknowledgements is not homogeneous. Some articles mention a significantly higher number of acknowledges than the average, with 6 articles mentioning more than 50 persons. As to the incidence of funding, almost 16% of the articles mention some form of external funding. If we break down the quota by year, we discover that the proportion of funding articles never exceeds 25% of the total and is rather stable in time. Let us now focus on the characteristics of the acknowledges population. The population counts 574 distinct acknowledges affiliated with 729 different universities from 47 countries and 538 cities. They are mentioned in 2073 articles written by 1,391 distinct authors. From the point of view of gender composition, the number of men significantly overcomes the number of women. The men are more than 3 times than the women. Interestingly, however, the quota of women is not equally distributed along the ranking of mentions. If we look at the group of highly mentioned acknowledges, that is, those that are mentioned more than 20 times in the corpus, the quota of women slightly decreases. In the group of the acknowledges receiving an intermediate number of mentions, the quota of women slightly increases, whereas in the group of lowly mentioned acknowledges, the quota almost coincides with that of the overall population. A chi-square test shows that the difference between these 3 quotas are statistically significant. In particular, as you can see from the plot on the left, the quota of women in the higher group is especially lower than expected. Interestingly, we find a significant difference also between the quota of women in the acknowledges population and the quota of women in the authors population. As you can see from the plot on the left, there are more women among the acknowledges than among authors, 21% against 17% respectively, even if in both populations women are far from representing half of the population. Again, the chi-square test shows us that the difference in the frequencies is statistically significant. Let us now look at the geographic distribution of the acknowledges. As you can see from the map, most of them are concentrated in the Western world, and in particular in the English-speaking world, with the United States that collect alone more than 1,700 acknowledges, whereas continental Europe, South America, and Asia follow at distance. The dominance of the English-speaking world is confirmed also at the level of cities, with the cities of New York, Oxford, and London counting each one more than 100 acknowledges. And it is confirmed also at the level of universities. The universities with the highest number of acknowledges are again placed in UK, US, Canada, and Australia. Now, this table shows the ranking of the top 10 most mentioned acknowledges in the corpus. Again, they are mainly based in Anglo-American universities. The ranking is dominated by David Chalmers with 103 mentions. However, from the point of view of mention, it is worth noting that Chalmers, who ranks first, receives more than twice the mentions of the philosophers in the 10th rank. This unequal distribution of mentions does not concern only the top ranks, but characterizes the entire population of the analogies. As you can see from the histogram on the left, the distribution of persons by number of mentions is highly skewed. Almost 60% of the analogies receives only one mention in the entire corpus, whereas the top 100 most mentioned persons receive alone almost 20% of all the mentions. Such inequality in the distribution of mentions may be the sign that cumulative advantage mechanisms occur in the corpus, so that persons that receive many mentions tend to receive even more. But what are the factors that influence the number of mentions that an analogy receives? To answer these questions, we tested on our data a multiple regression model that considered 5 different independent variables, namely the number of citations an analogy gathers in Scopus, the total number of publications she is the author of, the number of articles she has published in the top 5 journals of analytic philosophy, the affiliation to an institution placed in an English-speaking country, and lastly, the gender. The former 3 variables are different measures of prestige in terms of impact and productivity, whereas the latter 2 account for more sociological factors. The multiple regression allowed us to measure how much each of these variables contribute to the number of mentions that an analogy receives in our corpus. The results of the regression summarized in this table show that only 2 of the independent variables produce a significant effect on the dependent variable. Specifically, the number of publications in the top 5 journals is the factor that mostly influences the number of mentions received. Other things equal, each article published in these journals provides a bonus of around 2 mentions. The other variable with a notable effect is the affiliation with Anglo-American universities, which grants a bonus of 1.3 extra mentions. Also, being male provides a bonus of 0.3 mentions. These numbers may appear small, but if we consider that 60% of the analogies receive only 1 mention, we better appreciate how a bonus of 1 or 2 mentions can make a crucial difference in the ranking. However, the model I've just presented explains about 30% of the variance in the number of mentions. This means that the remaining variance is due to other characteristics of the analogies, such as, for instance, their helpfulness, academic power, institutional prestige, and so on. We analyze our data also from a network analytic perspective. We wanted to model as a network the following set of relationships. A group of authors on the left write papers and then publish them in journals. In turn, in these papers, various persons are mentioned, that is, the analogies. Now, if we focus on the relationships on the right side of the screen, we can model them as a 2-mode network. That is a network where 2 types of nodes occur. The nodes that represent articles on the left and the nodes that represent analogies on the right. These 2 types of nodes are connected by directed links, which represent the relation of mentioning. In this case, for instance, Article 1 mentions analogies A and B. Now, if we focus on the analogies nodes, we can build a new network where 2 analogies are connected when they are mentioned by the same paper, that is, when they are co-mentioned. In this case, analogies A and B appear together in paper number 1. Hence, in the new network, they are connected by a link of co-mention with strength 1. In the same way, C is connected with B with a link of strength 1, as they are mentioned together in article number 3. This operation, called projection, allows us to generate the analogies co-mention network. In the slide, you can see the result of this analysis applied to our data. The slide represents the co-mention network of the most mentioned analogies. This means that only those acknowledges with 10 mentions or more are represented as nodes of the map. The size of the nodes is proportional to the number of mentions, whereas the relative positions of the nodes on the map reflect their co-mentioning relations, so that the two acknowledges that are frequently mentioned together are placed closer on the map. Lastly, the color of the nodes represents the cluster they are attributed to by the clustering algorithm of VosViewer, the software I use to produce the visualization. As you can see, the network is characterized by a dense structure with 5 clusters and a high density of intercluster links. When we look at this kind of maps, the main question that guides their interpretation is whether there is an organizing principle that underlies the division in clusters. That is, what do the clusters correspond to? In this sense, a first hypothesis may be that clusters reflect subdisciplinary divisions. Indeed, there is a certain association between philosophical areas and clusters. The red cluster, for instance, mainly contains people working in metaphysics, whereas the blue cluster mainly hosts experts in philosophy of mind. However, the association is not perfect, and it is weakened, for instance, by the fact that epistemologists are found in all clusters. A second hypothesis may be that clusters reflect an institutional structure, that is, a division based on affiliations. In fact, certain clusters contain mainly persons affiliated with certain universities. However, the association between clusters and universities is in overall rather mild, as persons from different clusters are scattered in different institutions. Okay, let me now briefly sum up the main findings. Starting from the rates of formal and informal collaboration found in our corpus. If we take the co-authorship as a marker of formal collaboration, we find that the average number of co-authors per paper in our corpus slightly exceeds 1, showing that co-authorship is quite rare in recent analytic philosophy. The number of acknowledges mentioned in each paper, by contrast, tells us that informal collaboration is significantly more intense, with an average of 8 informal collaborators mentioned. Moreover, 94% of articles contain an acknowledgement. As to the acknowledges population, we can say that it is more than 4 times bigger than the population of formal authors, that it's mainly composed by men, even if the quota of female acknowledges is higher than the quota of women authors, that the acknowledges are mainly concentrated in the US and UK, that the most mentioned acknowledges are highly influential contemporary analytic philosophers based again in US and UK, and lastly, that mentions are not equally distributed among acknowledges. Indeed, few persons receive lots of mentions, and most persons receive few mentions, bringing about a pattern of mention concentration. As the factors that affect the number of mentions received, we found that an indicator of prestige, such as the number of articles published in top 5 journals, is a good predictor of mentions, with each article published in these journals that awards a bonus of 2 mentions. Also, being affiliated with institutions in the English-speaking world grants a bonus of 1 mention, and being male, on the other hand, grants 0.3 extra mentions. Lastly, from the analysis of the co-mention map, we can say that the analytic philosophy community that emerges from the analysis of the acknowledgements is dense and highly interconnected. That the structure of the map seems to reflect subdisciplinary communities, even if not completely. Analogously, clusters are only mildly associated with institutions. This means that persons are mentioned together in the acknowledgements, even if they do not belong to the same subdisciplines and are not affiliated with the same institution. Therefore, we can say that the relationships shown in the acknowledgements cross subdisciplinary and institutional divisions. Well, let me now conclude by sketching some topics for future research. The first idea for extending the present study is to refine the statistical model for predicting the number of mentions by integrating new variables. The second direction is to investigate which types of homophily occur between authors and acknowledges. This means to compare the characteristics of authors and acknowledges and investigate whether authors tend to acknowledge persons that are somehow similar to them. Such similarity may be intended along various dimensions, including institutional proximity, being affiliated with the same institution, topical proximity, working on the same topics, gender, or seniority. Do authors tend to mention people with the same seniority or not? Well, with this last slide, I've concluded my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and feel free to contact me at these email addresses for any question or comments. Goodbye.